Our statement is titled, African Civil Society Call for a Decisive Shift from Climate Promises to Implementation of Climate Justice Actions at UNFCCC SB64. At the 64th session of Subsidiary Body of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change commenced in Bonn, Africa Civil Society organizations coordinated by Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, later yet, an urgent and unequivocal message. Africa can no longer afford another cycle of climate negotiations characterized by delay, dilution, and deferral. For millions of Africans, climate change is not a future risk. It is a present, lived, and intensifying reality. Across the continent, prolonged droughts, devastating floods, cyclones, heat waves, and ecosystem degradation continues to destroy livelihoods, deepen food insecurity, displace communities, and undermine hard-won development gains. Yet Africa remains responsible for less than 4% of cumulative global greenhouse gas emissions, while bearing some of the most severe consequences of the crisis it did not create. The climate crisis in Africa is fundamentally, therefore, a justice issue. The outcomes of recent COP demonstrates both progress and persistent shortcomings. At COP28 in Dubai, parties adopted the historic global stocktake, recognizing the need to transition away from fossil fuels in energy systems and operationalizing of the Loss and Damage Fund. This represented a significant political breakthrough after years of resistance. However, commitments on implementation and finance remains inadequate. At COP29 in Baku again, parties adopted a new collective quantified climate finance goal and initiated the Baku to Belém roadmap that is intended to mobilize USD 1.3 trillion annually for developing countries by 2035. While this was an attempt to acknowledge the scale of the challenge, many developing countries and civil society organizations lightly expressed concerns that the agreed public finance commitments remained substantially below the documented needs, particularly in Africa. At COP30 in Belém, progress was recorded on adaptation indicators, but the much needed means of implementation, which essentially is adaptation finance, remained a mirage. Progress in just transition mechanisms attracted mixed signals, pro-rights and justice framing, but on the flip side, protectionist in character, with potent ability to delay transition from fossil fuels by developed countries. Parties failed to agree on the roadmap for transitioning away from fossil fuels, despite overwhelming scientific evidence and broad support from vulnerable communities. On an omission which exposed enduring influence of vested interest and the widening gap between climate science and political decision-making. SB64, therefore, arrives at a defining moment for multilateral climate governance. It must not become another procedural checkpoint on the road to COP31 in Turkey. It must become the platform through which parties restore trust, demonstrate ambition, and lay the ground for urgent decisions and implementation frameworks that respond to the realities confronting the vulnerable populations, especially in Africa. As SB34 commences this week, we are armed by the conspicuous omission of loss and damage and adaptation plans agenda items from the list of agenda presented by the SBI and SABSTA chairs for adoption. We align with the statement issued by the Africa Group of Negotiators at the opening plenary yesterday, where the same concerns were raised, and we reiterate that the negotiations devoid on loss and damage and NAPs is tantamount to abdication of justice, especially for the victims of climate change in Africa. Africa civil society enters SB64 with 3 overarching priorities. 1, climate finance must move from rhetoric to delivery. The promise of climate action without adequate means of implementation is meaningless. Developing countries continue to face an enormous financing gap that constrains adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage responses, and just transition efforts. Africa countries are being asked to increase ambition while simultaneously navigating debt distress, shrinking fiscal space, and escalating climate impacts, and this contradiction is neither fair nor sustainable. SB64 must therefore advance clear pathways for implementing especially Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement, which obliges developed countries to provide financial resources to developing countries. Climate finance must be public, grant-based, predictable, accessible, and additional to the existing development assistance. Adaptation finance, in particular, must be scaled significantly and directed towards local communities, women, youth, indigenous people, and frontline populations who are already bearing the cost of climate impacts. The commitments to further NCQG emerging from BEREM must now be translated into concrete delivery frameworks, timelines, and with clear tracking and accountability mechanisms. Second, Africa requires a just transition that is genuinely just. We reject narratives that frame decarbonization solely through the lens of emission reduction while ignoring the questions of equity, development, and energy access. More than 600 million Africans still lack access to electricity. A just transition must therefore support industrialization, job creation, skills development, energy access, and economic transformation. Decisions that enable African countries to build renewable energy systems, develop green industries, and create dignified livelihoods without replicating historical patterns of extraction, dependency, and this is the minimum that we do ask from from Bonn. We call for a dedicated financing window for nationally determined just transition pathways for stronger commitments on technology development and transfer. A just transition cannot become another unfunded aspiration. It must be backed by finance, technology, and capacity support commensurate with the scale of transformation required. Third, adaptation and resilience must be elevated to the center of global climate action. For Africa, adaptation is not optional. It is a matter of survival. The global goal on adaptation can only succeed if accompanied by robust means of implementation and indicators that actually reflect realities, traditional knowledge systems, and community resilience. Adaptation outcomes must be measured not only through technical metrics, but through improvement of food security, water availability, public health, ecosystem integrity, and human well-being. As negotiations progress, we remain deeply concerned by recurring patterns of continued undermining of ambition. Developed countries have repeatedly expressed hesitation regarding legally grounded obligations on climate finance, resisted stronger language on historical responsibility, and sought to broaden the contributor base in ways that risk diluting their commitments under the Convention and the Paris Agreement. We have also witnessed attempts to shift emphasis towards private financing while avoiding meaningful discussions on public finance obligations, debt burden, and structural inequalities embedded within the global finance architecture. We are aware of the implications of the global geopolitical context and its role in complicating the negotiations. We nevertheless assert that climate justice cannot become collateral damage in global geopolitical rivalries. The atmosphere does not negotiate, nor recognize political convenience. Delayed action today will impose far greater economic and social costs tomorrow, which negotiations or negotiators must be committed to avoid at all costs. We therefore call upon climate envoys, ministers, and negotiators from developed countries to demonstrate leadership commensurate with their historical responsibility and current capabilities. We urge them to move beyond procedural obstruction and embrace outcomes that reflect equity, science, and solidarity. Specifically, we call upon developed countries to commit to substantial increase in grant-based climate finance, establish a credible roadmap towards mobilizing and delivering USD 1.3 trillion annual climate finance goal, support adaptation finance targets aligned with assessed needs, operationalize financing arrangements for just transition in developing countries, strengthen technology transfer and capacity mechanisms, and ensure that future negotiations remain anchored in the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and, of course, respective capabilities. The success of SB64, therefore, should ultimately be judged not by the number of agenda items concluded, but whether it restores confidence on the multilateral process and delivers for the most affected by climate change. For Africa, favorable outcomes at SB64 would include measurable progress on climate finance arrangements, clear pathways for implementing adaptation commitments, strengthened support for just transition, enhanced accountability mechanisms, and negotiating frameworks that position COP31 in Turkey to adopt decisions that close implementation gaps rather than widen the same. Africa is not asking for charity. Africa is demanding for justice. A corresponding level of ambition from those with the greatest responsibility and capacity to act remains widely missing. As we gather here, we remind parties that every delay in negotiation translates into lost livelihoods, lost opportunities, and increasingly lost lives. The world has negotiated long enough. It is time to implement commitments, honor obligations, and place justice at the center of climate action. The future credibility of UNFCCC process depends on it. Thank you very much.